Hi, and welcome to another special edition of Talking About Teaching Economics. Today, I'm joined by biologist Mark Brigham. He's a professor at the University of Regina, and just recently, I understand, won a national prize for graduate supervision. So he might have some ideas about teaching and some remarkable notions about the overlap between biology as a discipline and economics as a discipline. So I'll start off, Mark. I'm going to ask you a really basic question. Can you explain what biology is for those of us who thought it was just memorization and chopping up frogs in high school?
It is interesting how all disciplines and all ideas have stereotypes and misconceptions about them. My research largely focuses on the study of nocturnal flying mammals that everyone knows of as bats. And I've spent much of my career trying to dispel myths about bats not flying in your hair, bats not sucking your blood, bats not being dangerous, bats not being blind, all those kinds of things. And so I think many people have the perception that you do, that being biology. In its essence, biology is the study of life. Of all the sciences, I would call it the broadest and the most difficult to make black and white. Under that umbrella of the study of life, to me, there are two aspects, and you often get classes that are named form and function classes. So it is the form of life, which is the memorizing of names. Are grasshoppers more closely related to mosquitoes, or are they more closely related to beetles? I mean, what's the relationship between various life forms, and why do we say that? The form of it, and then the function. How does life work? From the molecular levels of genes all the way up to different species operating in a community or an ecosystem. So it spans scales, but form and function, I think, sort of summarizes the study of life in its broadest essences.
So I can see when you get into the function side, I think that's probably where we're going to pick up a lot of the overlap between economics and biology.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, humans love to classify things. We do this all the time, and I mean, I will try to relate it to economics where I can, but you teach classes in microeconomics and macroeconomics, and I'm positive that there are places where students could argue, well, that's micro, not macro, and vice versa, and yet we've classified them as two entirely separate things. They're not, and
Right.
that happens all the time.
Right. So maybe with let's sort of explore some of the historical overlap between the disciplines, because there is a really common strong link coming about in the 1700s and 1800s.
Darwin read an awful lot of economic ideas. I mean, he read a lot of things, but economics and especially the ideas of Thomas Malthus were really instrumental in his thinking. And as an economist, you sort of laugh at that because it's older thinking that in many ways is discredited to a large extent now. But as an academic, we should never be afraid of proposing something that turns out to be wrong. If it advances the discipline and gets someone else to think about something, then we've done our job in that we've gotten people to think about things. And Malthus got Darwin to think about the idea that if populations were allowed without control to expand and expand, I mean, they would quickly overrun the earth. In one of my classes, I talk about herring, and one female herring, I think, can lay 10,000 eggs. And if all those eggs survived and all of the offspring survived, it would only take 8 generations, and herring would weigh more than the planet Earth does. And obviously that doesn't happen. So there's competition, and most don't make it. And that got to Darwin thinking, why? Well, who survives? And that ultimately led him to the idea of natural selection being a mechanism for evolution.
So just to translate this into economics terms, I mean, it's you're referencing Malthus as sort of the idea of giving constraint.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because that is really where economics starts, is the recognition of a constraint in the system somewhere. So yeah, maybe economists need to rehabilitate Malthus a little bit.
At his essence, I think that's what he was trying to say, although I'm quick to say that I have never read Malthus. And as a biologist, I would also say, most embarrassingly, that I've never read cover to cover On the Origin of Species by Darwin, because he was so terrified of the impact of his ideas that his writing is well and truly atrocious. He was a fabulous writer, lots of other cool things that Darwin has written that I've read and really enjoyed. But On the Origin of Species has to be one of the most boring, dull, horridly written books in the world, but it's crucially important.
And well, that speaks another similarity between the disciplines is economics, particularly in the last probably 30, 40 years, has really gotten away from reading the classics. Right? We don't go back. Like it's not uncommon at all for a student to come out of an undergraduate degree in economics with an honors even and not have read Smith. Which is one of my grumpinesses, but what are you going to do? So yeah, I find that interesting that there seems to be a parallel there as well.
Well, that's true, but I mean, you turned up your nose when I mentioned Malthus, and so how much have you read Malthus? I don't know, and that's entirely up to you whether you tell your audience that you have or you haven't.
I haven't. I've read in Malthus. I have
Right.
not read Malthus.
So, is it a classic or not? I say that's why I mentioned that.
Yeah.
All biology students really should read Darwin, but I'm hard pressed to tell them to do so when I have made an untold number of attempts and never managed it. Yes.
Malthus, I was one of the ones I've read Smith, I've read Marx, I've read a bunch of other stuff, but Malthus was one of those ones I just bogged down, and I found something more interesting to do very quickly.
Yes. And so how it then becomes human pigeonholing. What's a classic and why is it a classic, and what do we get out of it by reading it? And I would agree with you in a grumpy way that students and many of us are not as well read as we should be, especially in where our discipline has come from. But there's only so many hours in the day, and it tends to get put off.
Yeah, no, that's fair, because given the way the discipline, and at least in economics, has evolved, you're better off studying linear algebra and differential equations than you are going back and reading the original philosophy.
Yep. And for us, it's learning R and understanding how you do statistical analysis.
Yeah, well, we share a common
yes
nemesis, shall we say? No, and that's a real. I mean, the constraint is time, and it is real. So maybe a little hat tip to Malthus there.
Yes.
So, we've got this historical overlap. Where do you see the overlaps in the disciplines now?
I guess I can think of two things, and I know that we have talked about this, and we can argue about whether biologists have interpreted economic theory correctly or not. And we've argued that perhaps we haven't, and that's fine. It's still a way to look at things. But I'm just starting teaching a section in my animal behavior course about communication. And I'm breaking this down into 4 areas. That is, what's the function of communication signals? Where did they come from? How did they evolve? Okay. What channel do we best use? Are we better to use sound or vision or smell or whatever? And to me, the fourth one, or most important one, is what are the costs and benefits of using certain types of communication? And virtually everything that animals do when they behave, and we always have to think about this, and it is effectively economics. There are benefits to what you do, and there are costs. And for a trait or a behavior or something to evolve or to be maintained, the benefits have to outweigh the costs. But I think it's a mistake not to think that there aren't costs to doing certain things. So if you don't go out and try to find food, you're going to starve. And obviously that has really serious implications. But if you do go out and try to find something to eat, you might be taken by a predator where you're dead that way. So there are costs and benefits to doing or not doing those two things. And you have to weigh, okay, don't go out at night because that's when all the leopards are out and it's going to be really scary. So just go out in the daytime where my cost or risk is going to be lower.
No, I think that's a great example. And I mean, so just that basic input into evolutionary theory, I think, is really interesting. And one of the things I'm finding really fascinating as I get into some of the more genetic stuff is the wholesale adoption of game theory in biology. I just find that absolutely fascinating.
Mhm.
And this idea of evolutionary stable equilibria and that kind of thing.
It really is all over, and Darwin alluded to it, but more recent thinkers, I think, have done a better job, and that is, and in my own sort of area of study, so I'm interested in these funny animals, and I'm particularly interested in what happens when there's nothing to eat and they hibernate. And for decades and decades and decades, physiologists have been really keen on, oh, how long can they hibernate, and how low can they let their body temperature go, and how low can their metabolism go. And they never thought at all about the fact that there are costs to doing those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, yes, there's benefits, but we got to think of what's the disadvantage to it as well. Otherwise, why doesn't everything do it? And everything
Mm-hmm.
doesn't. And so keeping in mind the costs and the benefits is a really important thing.
No, absolutely. How do you think an intro economics class can be useful to a biology student? What do you see there as like what would you if you were going to send if you were going to say okay you should take economics, what are you hoping that student gets out of it?
Okay. I do tell students that, and we are a product of our history, and
Mm-hmm.
I one class short of an economics minor in my undergraduate biology degree. So I found economics interesting and fascinating. I don't think it was until later in my life that I put together, oh, they were talking about many of the same bloody things,
Mm-hmm.
but they were. But the idea of cost, benefits, and constraints for first year students, and even if they learn, okay, there's a constraint to how much time I should spend studying each of the subjects that I'm taking in this particular semester. And um, I, if I spent all of my time, absolutely every waking moment, I maybe could make my teaching 5% better. But is it worth it to spend all that time to incrementally improve what I think I already do quite well? Or am I better off spending a good chunk of that time admitting my teaching is only 90% as good as it could be, and spending time on research or mentoring grad students or whatever? And
Mm-hmm.
those are all constraints because we only have so much time. Um, I, I'm too far away from taking micro and macroeconomics to remember whether optimization was part of that at a first year level. But it certainly in what I do is an
Mm-hmm.
important concept that needs to be thought about. But I think the idea of trade-offs, cost
Mm-hmm.
benefit, risks, those sorts of things, I
Yeah.
certainly I introduce in the teaching that I do in first year.
So I absolutely you've hit most of the big core takeaway concepts for an intro micro course, particularly opportunity cost is a language we use a lot, and that's one of those ones that is pretty portable. So let's flip it though. Where do you see should econ grads be compelled or directed to take intro bio?
I guess we have a term that we use very derisively called social Darwinism, that as an economist, you should be willing to do anything but murder in order to improve your business or whatever. And that's the Darwin's idea of evolution taken to an extreme that he
Mm,
never meant. And yes, from an evolutionary point of view, individuals should be selfish, but you can go way too far with that so that it
mhm,
becomes destructive, and therefore the benefits then are outweighed by the costs that you do that. And it's as a result of winning this silly award, I have to go and give an hour and a half talk at the meeting, which is the cost worth the benefit? I don't know, but I'm going to talk about the selfishness of supervision. And that is, okay, I'm going to spend lots of time trying to help grad students do better projects. That comes at a cost to me, but hopefully the benefit is that they do a better project. The papers that result at the end are better. And guess who's the one that gets salary increases and promotions and all that sort of stuff? It's not the graduate students, it's
Hmm.
me. So that by being selfish, thinking about where it's going to get me, I end up being altruistic and being helpful to those students.
Hmm.
And that concept, as soon as you say, oh, I'm going to be selfish, that can have very beneficial outcomes for the people that you're, if your reasoning is selfish. And hey,
Yeah.
I've tried to have a good career and tried to increase my salary and tried to get promoted, and I haven't done it at the expense of students, but I've tried to do it such that they benefit as at the same time,
Right.
but it comes in a different form.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean that you're that sounds exactly like you're riffing on Smith's. We don't depend on the altruism of the brewer, the baker, and the butcher for our dinner. We appeal to their self-interest.
Yep.
And so getting the incentives aligned at an institutional level, I think, is really, really important. So we've kind of played at collaborating a little bit. We did do one honor student supervision project together. Why do you think, if there is this substantive overlap in concept and space, why don't biologists and economists work together more often?
One's tempted just to blurt out an answer. And I think, like most complicated questions, there isn't a
Hmm.
black and white answer.
Sure.
The pragmatic thing that comes to mind for me most quickly is that most economists at university campuses live in a different bloody building than where biologists live, and
Well, that's
therefore
that's absolutely true.
they I mean, um, they don't physically run into each other very
Hmm.
often. So I mean, I guess it gets a little personal, but we interacted for reasons that had nothing to do with academics whatsoever, got
Hmm.
to know each other, and I think learned to appreciate what the other did, which is ultimately, I think, why the collaboration happens.
Hmm.
Because would I ever have stuck my head in your door? I wouldn't know where your office is if it
Right.
hadn't been learning about each other in another context. So I think that matters.
Hmm.
So I think it's important that we, in this day and age where time is so important, but we be willing to spend some time stalking the halls and just talking to people. Or
Right.
when you sit down in a committee meeting, introduce yourself and get to know the person that you're with, because who knows what is going to come out of it. And
That's right.
nothing may, but at very least you meet someone that you might want to go out for dinner with sometime or something like that sort of thing. So yeah, I think just physical overlap
Mm.
matters. I would honestly say I don't think within biology there's probably the more small scale types, the molecular biologists and the geneticists may not see as much economics in what they do
Mm.
as compared to the behavior and evolutionary types that I tend to associate with
Right.
more. So the discipline of biology that you study may be important. Um,
Mm.
but it's just the perception that these are two disciplines that are really, really distant. And I just goes back to your reading of the classics. I mean, people don't get where Darwin's some of his ideas came from.
Hmm.
And all you have to do is understand that a little bit, and you realize, hey, that's economics, that's geology. I mean, these things are really important for us to understand that we're welded in that way.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten away with siloing has been, I think, a real impediment to this kind of thing.
And I don't know how you fix that except just to encourage. I mean, I go back to my selfishness. Uh, I had a conversation with a colleague who I won't identify, but we both know very well, about the fact that a person who was hired at the same time he was never volunteers for committees, is never asked to do anything, and I don't know that I would even recognize them as a faculty member here, even though they've been here for a long period of time. I can think of all kinds of neat relationships I have with people because I've been on boring committees. And
Hmm.
you think selfishly, well, don't go on a boring committee because it's just going to be boring. But you never know, if you open your mind to it, who you can meet in those
Mm.
situations and perhaps get something out of in a totally different way.
No, that's a good point. One of the things I was when in asking that question that occurred to me. I mean, the idea of social Darwinism, which you brought up, has really been sort of it's been one of those misconceptions from economics that or of
That
economics that
makes
I think needs to be addressed, and it might be part of that reticence for some sort of collaboration where this idea comes in and we get sort of tarred with this giant brush.
And I would say here is, I said it specifically to give an
Mhm.
example, but I think
No, it's fair.
there would be many biologists who would equate an economist with a business person, and
Hmm.
those are two different cats. And I perhaps should say, I think social Darwinism to me is more appropriately should more appropriately be used to tar business people as opposed to economics people, because they are different.
Well, even social Darwinism is not quite a full capturing of what we're studying in terms of the business behavior. I mean,
Right.
reading Smith, and this is one of my hobby horses. If you're going to read Smith, you have to read all of Smith.
Okay.
Right? You can't just read The Wealth of Nations. You have to read the Theory of Moral Sentiments first, where he's talking about what makes up a human and sympathy and empathy and all that really important stuff, and then you move on. But yeah, that's a hobby horse that's not really helpful for right now.
No, but we all do this, and
Hmm.
it's not just in the ivory tower. We all cast dispersions and have stereotypes and all those sorts of things about
Hmm.
disciplines, ethnic groups, body sizes, you name it. We do it all over the
We
place.
take shortcuts, and
Yes,
when we're talking about disciplines, academic disciplines, those shortcuts are often based on gross simplifications that are not correct.
right.
Yeah.
I couldn't concur more. So yeah, I think economics and biology have a lot in common, that could lead to some very productive things.
Hmm.
And but you have to have people that get to know each other, respect each other, and find
Mm.
those things that they can do together. And um, I think for most academics, uh, many of the people they collaborate with, either they did degrees with, or they were locked up in a room together for a period of time, and they've learned to enjoy each other's company. And
Hmm.
much less do they collaborate with people that are really distant from them. And only the very, very bright folks that understand how that can be really good and go out of their way to seek it, do it very much.
Mm. No, because the costs are higher. To riff on one of the examples you are, the more different we are, the greater the cost of collaboration.
And the greater the risk that you're going to spend a whole lot of time and have nothing come out of it, right?
Yeah, high risk, high reward, but
Yes, exactly.
there's a lot of downside there too.
There is.
Um, let's try and bring this back to the classroom a little bit. So let's talk about some of the things where there are similarities, commonalities that you're trying to get across the classroom. So let's talk about this mode of analysis where you're looking at costs and benefits for behaviors.
Okay.
How do you how do you have any ideas or notions of how to get that across? Or how do you let's start with what you do and then let's try and stretch it out.
From a teaching point of view, I
Hmm.
guess in its simplest form, I think we have to be entertainers, and we have to prime students' mind to be open to listening and really taking in what we're saying.
Mm.
And if we're talking heads at the front of the room that are boring as snot, then we may say interesting things, but students just aren't going to take it in.
Hmm.
So today was my first lecture in communication, and I turned up in a set of coveralls to the lecture, and I said to the students, "So you don't know me, and just tell me your first impression." based on me being in front of you. And they say, I mean, one said you're a farmer, and one said you're an auto mechanic, and one said you're a pilot, and a number of things like that. And then I peel off the coveralls into what I'm wearing now. And one said they just let you out of a disco, or they said you're retired, or and the whole point was to show how, with a very, very simple change of message,
Mm-hmm.
just change of cotton, that
Yeah.
the message can be very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they all giggled and laughed and thought it was neat. And I mean, my colleagues think I look like an idiot when I stomp through the halls with this set of coveralls on, but I find it fun, and it doesn't embarrass me or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I try to do different things.
Right.
To the question, when I'm talking about foraging behavior, I take to the classroom a whole bunch of jelly beans, and they come in 4 different colors: red, green, yellow, and black. The black ones are toxic. And the yellow, red, and green ones all have different values. And then I set out a scenario where students have to forage and collect jelly beans. And I bring a prize. And whoever collects the most jelly beans of the highest value gets the prize. And then, unbeknownst to them, whoever falls below a threshold, which means they starve to death, has to stand up and sing a song for the rest of the class. So there's a cost to not performing well, and there's a benefit to doing well. They all know the rules of the game. They're all clued in as to what they have to do, but the jelly beans are distributed randomly, and there's certain rules for how they can collect them. So it introduces some randomness to who does well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's amazing how, when you add up the scores at the end, in a class of 10 where there's 300 total points, you get differences between 50 and 5, and
Oh,
the
wow.
difference is huge. And
Mm-hmm.
then for the rest of the semester, I'll walk into class and say, hey, Sandra, how's the loser today? And I keep it going. And is it offensive? Maybe to some students, but it's meant to be illustrative of,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you failed, and from a natural selection point of view, you're dead. Your genes are not going into the next generation. You didn't make it, and so that's a huge cost.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a be a great way to teach search theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and get that real message across about searching and matching and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, for the rest of the section, which is 4 or 5 lectures, then the students have a frame of reference. And when I talk about, okay, how should animals sort themselves out in a
Mm-hmm.
habitat, and say, well, if there's lots of food, there should be more animals, and little food, there should be fewer. And I said, yeah, remember how the jelly beans were distributed? And at the big pile, there was a line of 5 of you. Where there was only a few jelly beans, there was only 1 of you. You did it without ever thinking about it. You just
Mm-hmm.
realized that's the better place. And selection has shaped all organisms to do things like that.
No, that makes a lot of, yeah. And I'm going to pick up on something you said there. What you're doing is you're creating a common experience and a common reference point, which is so important for creating community around the classroom. And I think that's something it's harder to do in large classes, obviously, but I think it's so important.
It is. I mean, I've done similar exercises for 30 or 40 students. I find it
Mm-hmm.
harder. I still think it can be done for
Mm-hmm.
big ones, but it is definitely harder. And yes, it's creating community, but for me, it goes back to the idea of entertainment. And if
Mm-hmm.
we can, I mean, we do what we do because we think it's cool. And if we can convey ways to students that, look, I think this is cool, and here's a fun way to think about it, and they have a little bit of fun, then I think they're going to remember it a little bit better, and perhaps use it to think about things more deeply. Not all will, but
No.
if I have fun doing it, and that enthusiasm and enjoyment comes across,
Mm.
then I think the students are going to have more fun, and heck, life is too short not to have fun.
Amen. I mean,
Yes.
that's almost all profs do this. You're going to work in jokes that are just for you. Um,
Yes.
and that's okay. Lean into it. So when you've got some of these really big, heavy, sort of squishy ideas that you're trying to get across, cost benefit, whatever.
Yep.
Um, how do you assess those? Like, do you have any different approaches to assessment to know whether or not that exercise or whatever has landed?
It's a really good question. I guess I had an opportunity to do this 2 weeks ago that I think worked quite well. Can't always do it.
Mm.
But I make the students in this class, they have to go to a field station for a week before classes start and do an independent project. And the goal of the week at the field station is to collect the data. And it is the cart before the horse, because they're doing a project on animal behavior before they've taken any of the theory of animal behavior. But climate forces that upon us. Anyway, so they have to end up writing effectively a scientific manuscript based on the data they collect of what you would do as a scientist. And I'm trying to mimic and model what I do in my research life. They haven't done this a whole lot, and therefore early in the semester, on a weekly basis, I get them to read a paper, and then we come to class for them to discuss that paper. And on purpose, I pick some papers that are good, but I also pick some papers that are really, really crappy, and to show them that you have to be critical of what you read and think about, that it's not all good. Just because it gets published somewhere doesn't make it good. But I had an opportunity 2 weeks ago. I had a former student in town. She won a University Alumni Award, and she arrived in town early enough to come to my behavior class. And I said, would you be willing to come? And she said, sure. And then what I didn't tell her was that I assigned the students a paper that she had just written, to be the one that we would critically evaluate. And when I told the students that we were going to do this, they said, well, we can't do that. How could we possibly be critical in front of her? And she's a dean, for heaven's sakes. How can we do that? And I said, she would be appalled if you weren't critical and trying to poke holes into what she'd written, because that's what, as academics, we're always looking for, is to people to come up with an idea that maybe we didn't think about. And in my world, if someone gets upset by that, then they're not an academic that you want to spend much time with, because they're way too sensitive. Anyway, I evaluate students' ability to talk about these things. Very simple scale, 0 if they don't open their mouths, 1 if they say something remotely intelligent, and 2 if they say something that I think is actually quite bright. And it's not hard to get a 2. All of the students warmed to this idea because the colleague who was in the classroom was enthusiastic about it. And they all end up, one of them said, Mark told us that you're not supposed to do this. And Martina just turned to the student and said, Mark's not always right. And it was, I think, fabulous to see that repartee and the dissecting of what she'd written. And yes, it was quite a good paper, but there was things about it that I thought could be improved. And the students got to many of those things and realized that this wasn't a blood sport. This was fun.
Well, and yeah, there seems to be, I don't know what's happened in biology over the last little while, but there has been a marked tone change in economics, particularly at conferences and seminars. I mean, when I was first starting out, it was a boxing match. It was a bit of rough and tumble, and I tend to enjoy that kind of thing, but not everybody does, I get. And that's gone in economics. Is that something that's happened in biology as well, that where the tone has become much more polite applause and much less challenging engagement?
Yes, I would say it has, and I think we have gone, and my life becomes stories. But the very first talk I ever gave at a scientific meeting, I'd been a master's student for 3 months, and I gave my talk. And someone stood up and said, your statistics are wrong, and sat down. And that's all they said. And as a brand new grad student, that was really very hard to take. And I think something like that is entirely inappropriate, that you take the student aside in a quiet space and said, so why did you do what you do? And what did you think? Do you think that's the best way, et cetera, et cetera?
Mm.
And now we just say, oh, good talk, good talk, good talk. And
Yeah.
that's rubbish as far as I'm concerned. The whole point of putting your work out there is to try to encourage real dialogue about
Hmm.
what are the assumptions? How did you get to that conclusion? And do you really trust this set of data? Da 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 da. However you do that, but in a respectful way.
Hmm.
And I think to me, and it reflects my advancing age, face-to-face society has become ever so respectful. All of the horrid stuff has gone to social media, where you don't have to look someone in the face and tell them,
Mm.
sorry, Jason, I think your ideas are not worth the paper they're written on, and here's why.
Hmm.
And we need to get back to somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point about the schism between modes of politeness. Yeah, all the vitriol and rough and tumble is now computer mediated,
Yes.
and there's and face-to-face interaction has become absolutely and utterly banal.
Yep. I
That's
think we should, I mean, it's very important to me. There's a separation between doing good science and communicating that science in a good way. And
Mhm.
I've always worked hard to try to help and encourage students to at least be able to communicate what they did in a way that's clear and evident. And it really bugs me when people sort of always come up to my students and say, good talk, good talk, good talk. Tell them what they could have done better in a nice way,
Oh,
but
yeah.
we need to help each other get better at what we do. And I mean, we all have some bad habits in speaking and
Mhm.
writing and things like that, and let's help each other get better. And it's
Yeah.
not horrible to say, look, Jason, you just don't talk loud enough, that can't hear you, and open, or as my father used to say, bounce it off your bloody diaphragm so that we can hear you at the back
Yeah.
of the room.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing to say, as long as it's said in a polite way. But you
Mhm.
can be critical, and it doesn't have to be on social media hidden behind some nickname. Oh, Dr. Childs can never hear him because he doesn't enunciate. Well, that's really being lazy.
But the other thing, one of the things you just mentioned, that talking about in analyzing this stuff, and a place where I think there's a lot of overlap in what we need to be doing in the classroom, and that's the role of assumptions. I mean, everybody, there is this mythos around science with a
Yep.
capital S, that you're not making the same assumptions in economics because we're really explicit about our assumptions. We take a hit, but still trying to get students to know and understand what assumptions are being made. Do you have any tricks or approaches to delivering that little piece?
I guess the thought that comes to mind immediately is not to use biology, but is to use statistics, and the because it tends to be more black and white, that there are clear sets of assumptions about what you can and can't apply a particular statistical test to. The
Mm-hmm.
data have to be normally distributed, or they have to fit a certain sort of distribution, or
Mm-hmm.
you have to have relatively equal sample sizes, or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that I try to get across to students, okay, this isn't a class in statistics, it's a class in biology, but you're going to get called on what statistical analysis you use to analyze your data, and therefore you better know the assumptions that will
Mm-hmm.
apply to what test you're using, and be able to answer, why did you use that particular test? And I guess the other thing that comes that I try to get across, and in all of my time I have never managed to, but when I'm teaching about evolutionary biology, getting across the concept, and it's not an assumption, it's really what Darwin said. Individual organisms are selected to be successful or not. Whether they are or not, there's some element of chance, but
Mhm.
selection acts on individuals. And then what changes through time is population. So the frequencies of genes in a population will change. And if lots of individuals that are red-haired and fat do really well, then over time the population is going to become fatter and more red-haired. But it's because of the selection pressure on individuals. Trying to get students to understand the difference between selection acting on individuals and populations changing, despite my very best efforts, is something that I have never been successful at doing. Everyone wants selection to happen on populations. Oh,
The group level.
group level. And
Yeah.
there's lots and lots and lots of evidence to suggest that it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And yet, that's, and I say I wouldn't call it an assumption. It's just a knowledgeable thing.
Well, it's a nuance. It's a
Yes.
really important nuance, and yeah, that, and again, well, we're back to overlap, that selection and that filter or absorbing barrier. And why do we end up with firms that look the way they do? And the difference is, of course, you can get mimetic um, change as well as genetic change.
Yep.
But yeah, this idea of selection and how selection works, and that it's not instantaneous. I mean, that's one of the big things, because we do all these models, and it's always we jump right. There's almost no out of equilibrium analysis, and
Yes.
we jump right to the new. It's like, oh no, that's not what happens, and that is, yeah, that nuance is really hard to get across. And I can see, yeah, the conflict between individual level selection leading to population changes being, and how that's different from selecting on a group. Yeah, that would be.
It's hard, but it also leads to me, if you're a reasonable instructor, to me, that nuance is really, really simple and evident and obvious. But for me to say, oh, this is easy, is totally wrong, because most people don't get it.
Yeah.
And it's therefore it's not easy. And something about me has allowed me to understand this. And I mean, I don't understand calculus, but I certainly have lots of colleagues who would say sort of x squared, take the derivative of, gets to 2x. That's simple. There's nothing to that. That's
Yeah.
really easy. Well, it's not
Sure, why
easy for
not?
all of us, right? So,
No, and we are wired differently. So yeah.
mhm. So
No, that's a good
I
point.
think we have to be very careful not just to jump and say, this is easy. What's wrong with you people?
Mhm.
When you try different approaches and you have this particular issue year after year, it's kind of depressing because I don't know how to do it any better, except
Mhm.
try to be as clear as possible. But it seems to be an assumption or a nuance that is really hard to get across.
Mm. So I think we're at a good place to sort of wrap this up, but I'll give you the last word. And imagine you're sitting at a welcome dinner or a mentoring dinner, and you've been placed beside, maybe you've been punished for something. You've been placed beside a brand new economics instructor who's going to be running their first classes in introductory economics.
Mhm.
What advice would you want to leave them with?
I think the biggest piece of advice for people starting out to teach is, don't worry if you don't get through it all. That we almost always have this set of topics, and this is the curriculum.
Mm,
That it doesn't matter in many respects whether you get through it all. I- yes, you need to pay attention to pace and to make sure that your students are with you, but if you don't get to the very last topic that you were going to spend 3 or 4 lectures on, just don't sweat it. I mean, it's there's no way that we can teach people everything. And if you end up by saying, like, there's this really cool topic that I didn't get to, you'll hear about it somewhere else. Or if you don't and you become interested, come and chat with me about it or whatever. But I think don't sweat. That is I think a really important advice for anyone. But make it fun. make this enjoyable for you. I hear too many colleagues who, oh, I got to go and teach. Yeah, there are some students that take up a lot of time that can be a pain, et cetera, et cetera. But almost invariably in any class, there are students that are good, that are really soaking up what you say. And we have the real benefit that we can pay attention to those people. And frankly, although many people in institutions may not like to hear this, if there are others who don't really care, then that's their problem, not mine.
Mm.
And so I try to derive as much pleasure, satisfaction, and enjoyment from really helping the ones that care. And that's not necessarily just the ones with the best grades. There
Mhm.
are students that really try very hard that aren't going to get super grades, but it's very easy to recognize that they're really trying. They're coming to class prepared. They ask questions. They're keen. Those ones are just so much fun to deal with.
Great. Thank you. My guest today has been Mark Brigham, biologist at the University of Regina.